The gates of the town creaked shut behind her. That sound, a groan of wood and iron, was louder than any church bell. It was a final sound, a sound of ending. Dust billowed up, thick and brown, coating her worn-out shoes, clinging to the hem of her dress. The woman, who was barely 22, pulled a thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. It didn't do much against the chill in the air, but it was all she had. Beside her, a little girl, maybe 5 years old, gripped her hand. The child's fingers were like tiny bird bones, and they were trembling. No one from the town came to say goodbye. They came to watch. Their faces were carved from stone. Their eyes were like chips of flint, sharp and cold. They stood in a silent line, a wall of judgment. A woman marked by shame was supposed to disappear quietly. And she was trying to. But the silence didn't stop the whispers. They followed her, sticking to her back like thorns. The child stumbled on the road. It was all gravel and ruts, and her feet were bare. Her mother bent down, her own arms shaking, and lifted the girl. It wasn't the child's weight that made her tremble. It was the hunger. The woman hadn't eaten a real meal in 4 days. Her little girl had eaten even less. They walked on, putting distance between themselves and the town. Soon the walls were just a dark line on the horizon, a smudge of wood and smoke against the sky. But she could still hear the preacher's voice ringing in her ears. Sin leaves no door open, he had thundered from his pulpit, and no roof to rest beneath. He had looked right at her when he said it, his eyes burning holes into her soul. He made her feel like a living warning, a lesson carved into flesh for all the good people to see. The town elders had nodded along, their faces grim. The women had clutched their own children closer, turning their backs on her, as if her shame was a disease you could catch. The road ahead was empty. It stretched out under a hot sun, merciless and bare. Weeds with sharp thorns grew at its edges, reaching out like claws. The little girl whimpered, just once, a tiny broken sound. Then she fell silent again, her lips pressed into a thin white line. She was only 5, but she had already learned a hard lesson. Complaining didn't bring you food. It didn't bring you mercy. It brought you nothing. Her mother carried her for as long as she could. When her own knees started to buckle, she set the girl down. They walked in a grim silence. The only sounds were their ragged breaths and the lonely cry of a hawk circling high above. By the 4th day, the hunger wasn't just an ache in her belly. It was a thick fog in her mind. She saw it in her daughter, too. The way the little girl swayed when she walked. The way her feet dragged in the dust. The way her eyes had a glassy, faraway look. The woman knelt down. She ripped a long strip of cloth from the hem of her own dress. She gently wrapped the rags around her daughter's blistered, bleeding feet. It was the last thing she had to give. A piece of her dress, the strength in her body, and a stubborn, burning refusal to just lie down and die. Just then the wind shifted. It carried a new smell, not just dust and weeds. It smelled of horse. She thought it might be a trick of her tired mind, a ghost scent from a life she used to know. But then she saw him, a rider appearing at the top of a low hill. He was tall in the saddle, sitting on a big chestnut horse. The wide brim of his hat cast a deep shadow over his face. He saw them, and he slowed his horse to a walk. The woman's whole body went stiff. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Men on horseback had only ever brought her pain. She pulled her daughter behind her, trying to shield the small, frail body with her own. The rider just sat there on his horse, watching them. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Then he swung himself down from the saddle. His boots hit the dry earth with a soft thud. He was young, maybe 26 or so. His shoulders were broad, the kind of broad that comes from hard work. His hands were calloused and scarred from handling ropes and leather. When he finally looked up, his eyes weren't sharp or cruel. They weren't filled with pity either. They were just steady. It was the child who moved first. Hunger made her bold, where fear kept her mother frozen. She stepped out from behind her mother's legs. Her small face was pale and smudged with dirt, her hair a tangled mess. She looked up at the tall stranger. Her voice was a tiny, cracked whisper, almost like a prayer. "Mama was cast out from the city," she said. "We've been starving for 4 days." The words just hung there in the hot, still air. They sounded too big, too heavy for such a small child to carry. The cowboy's jaw muscle twitched. He looked from the little girl to her mother. The woman stood there, rigid as a statue, her shoulders pulled back. She was bracing herself for the usual scorn, for the judgment she had heard 100 times before. She was waiting for the blow. But the cowboy didn't raise his voice. He didn't sneer. He just spoke in a low, rough voice, a voice like gravel, but it was the gentlest sound she had heard in years. "You're coming with me," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. The woman's lips parted, but no words came out. She couldn't trust it. Kindness this sudden felt like a mirage, like finding water in a desert only to watch it disappear when you get closer. Her daughter swayed on her feet, her eyes fluttering closed. The cowboy took a step forward and put a hand on the girl's shoulder to steady her. He looked at the woman again, his gaze unwavering. Ain't no child should carry hunger like that. The sun was starting to set, painting the empty road in long, dark shadows. The woman felt a choice pressing down on her, heavy as a stone. She could turn away. She could keep walking into the endless wilderness with nothing but her shame for company. Or she could take a step toward this quiet stranger, toward an unknown future. She didn't believe in mercy anymore. But she believed in her daughter's hunger. Behind them, the distant town was a dying ember in the last light. Its gates were closed. Its judgment was final. In front of them, the cowboy's horse stood waiting, its reins hanging loose. It was a silent invitation. The little girl tugged on her mother's hand, her eyes wide with a look the woman hadn't seen in a long, long time. It looked like hope. The woman took a slow, shuddering breath. Her heart was pounding, a wild drum of mistrust against her ribs. Her body remembered every slammed door, every harsh word. But she stepped forward. The cowboy gave a small, almost invisible nod. He bent down and lifted the child into his arms. He held her as if she weighed nothing at all. He didn't say another word. He just turned and started walking toward the horizon. The woman followed. Each step was heavy with the memory of where she had been, and each step trembled with the question of where she was going. In that fading light, as the road stretched out before them, she felt the first fragile thread of something she thought she'd never feel again. The ride to his homestead felt like it took forever. In reality, it was probably less than an hour, but for her, every hoofbeat was a question hammering in her mind. Why? What does he want? What will be the price? She walked beside the horse, even though he'd offered to let her ride. Her pride was a stubborn rod in her back, holding her up when all her body wanted to do was collapse into the dust. The child slept against his chest, her small head tucked under his chin. The woman's eyes kept darting between them. She felt a confusing mix of gratitude and deep, gnawing suspicion. She'd seen kindness from men before. It always came with a price tag, and she had nothing left to pay with. When the cabin finally came into view, a dark shape against the purple evening sky, she felt a wave of both relief and dread. Relief that it was a real place, not just a dream. Dread that it would be just another place to be judged, another door to be slammed in her face. It was a simple cabin made of rough-hewn logs. The windows were small. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney. A few chickens scratched in the dirt near the porch steps. A dog lifted its head and watched them approach, but it didn't bark. It wasn't a fancy place. It wasn't rich, but it was shelter. He swung down from the horse, setting the child gently on her feet. The girl blinked, waking up. When she saw the chickens, a little gasp of wonder escaped her lips. "Mama," she whispered, "they got feathers all gold." The pure, simple delight in her daughter's voice made the woman's throat tighten. She couldn't remember the last time she had heard that sound, the sound of joy. The cowboy pushed the cabin door open. He stood aside, holding it for her, as if it were her own home. She hesitated on the threshold, her hand hovering in the air. Inside, it was warm. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else. Something savory. Beans simmering in a big iron pot over the fire. She finally took a step inside, her daughter pulling her eagerly by the hand. The room was one single space, a long wooden table, its surface scarred with the marks of countless meals. A bed pushed against the far wall, a shelf holding a few jars of preserved food. "Not much," he said quietly, but it's more than you had." He didn't wait for a reply. He went to the fireplace, ladled the thick stew into 2 bowls. He slid one across the table to her and set the other in front of the child. She just stared at the bowl. The steam curled up from it, like a promise she was too afraid to believe. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the spoon. Her daughter had no such hesitation. The clatter of her spoon against the bowl was a loud, sharp sound in the quiet room. It was both a comfort and a knife to the heart, a stark reminder of just how close to starvation they had been. The woman ate slowly, forcing herself to take small bites, even though her stomach screamed for more. She was terrified that if she ate too fast, she would wake up and find herself back on the dusty road, the cabin and the warm food, nothing but a cruel dream. Across the table, the cowboy ate in silence, his eyes downcast. He wasn't ignoring her, he was giving her space. He didn't ask her name, he didn't ask her story. He just pushed a piece of cornbread toward her. "Eat slow now," he said. "Food's meant to last, not vanish." The little girl, her cheeks puffed out with beans, let out a small giggle. The sound surprised all of them. It broke the heavy silence like a ray of sun bursting through a crack in the wall. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the mother allowed herself to take a full breath. She tasted the beans, yes, but for a fleeting moment she also tasted the possibility of safety. When the bowls were empty, he got up and put another log on the fire. Sparks danced up the chimney, painting the rough log walls in flickering light. She sat there, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't know what to do, what to say. What did she owe this man? How long could they stay before he named his price? The shame she carried was a coiled snake in her gut, always there, always ready to strike. The memory of the preacher's voice, the town's cold eyes, the slammed doors. It all came rushing back. They had told her so many times that she was worthless, that she was poison, that she had started to believe them. Her daughter, sleepy and full, climbed into her lap. The little girl's head rested against her chest, her breathing evening out. The solid, warm weight of her child was an anchor in the swirling sea of her fears. For the first time in days, a tiny bit of the tension in her shoulders began to ease. The cowboy sat in his chair by the fire, his face unreadable in the shifting light. His silence wasn't cold or menacing, it was contained. As if he understood that words could be weapons, and he was choosing not to use them. The mother stroked her daughter's hair, humming a lullaby so softly it was barely a sound. The fire crackled, the wind whispered against the outside walls, and still he said nothing. It was the quiet that was getting to her. In the quiet there was too much room for memories. She remembered the preacher's face, twisted with righteous fury. "The Lord lifts up the lowly," he'd said, "and he fills the hungry with good things, but only if they walk in the path of righteousness." His eyes had condemned her on the spot. He had declared that her hunger was a punishment from God. And in the depths of her despair, she had believed him. But now her child was fed. Her own body was warm, and the preacher's words sounded less like divine prophecy and more like simple human cruelty. When she was sure the girl was fast asleep, the woman finally looked across the fire at the silent man. "Why?" Her voice was raw, hoarse from disuse. It carried the weight of every day of her exile, every ounce of her suspicion. "Why would you take us in?" He didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames, as if he were looking for the answer there. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "Because I seen too many left to the cold," he said, not looking at her. "Ain't right. Ain't right for a child to starve when I got bread to share." She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat feeling sharp as a stone. Could it be that simple? Could kindness just be kindness, with no hidden angle, no price to pay? She didn't know if she could trust his words, but the steady, even breathing of her daughter sleeping against her chest was proof enough. For tonight, at least, they were safe. The fire burned down to glowing embers. The shadows in the cabin grew long and deep, reaching across the floorboards like grasping fingers. She felt their weight, the weight of her own unending doubt. Would this place still be a shelter tomorrow? Or would it cast them out too, once the town's ugly whispers found their way to its door? The cowboy leaned back in his chair, tipping his hat low over his eyes. But just before he did, his gaze flickered over to her. It was steady, unyielding. There was no demand in that look, no hint of a bargain. There was only a quiet question, one that tomorrow would have to answer. And in that heavy silence, she understood with a sudden, chilling certainty. This night, this warmth, this safety, it wasn't theirs to keep. Not yet. Morning arrived with the smell of brewing coffee and damp earth. The little girl woke first. She padded across the cold wooden floor in her bare feet, her eyes wide and bright with the new discovery of safety. She pressed her small nose against the window pane, watching the chickens peck and scratch in the yard. Then she turned to her mother, a huge grin spreading across her face. The woman managed a small, tired smile in return. A night of rest had eased the ache in her bones, but the worry in her mind still had its claws in deep. Safety, she knew, was a fragile thing. A loan that could be called in the moment gossip caught up to you. The cowboy was outside, saddling his horse as the sun rose, a pale orange disk over the flat plains. He came back inside and handed the mother a small leather pouch. It clinked with the sound of coins. "Take this," he said. "Buy what you need in town." His words were simple, matter of fact, but the pouch felt impossibly heavy in her hand. It felt like a debt she could never repay. She tried to give it back, but he just shook his head. "Ain't charity," he said, his voice firm. "A house needs flour, same as a fire needs wood." So she went. Her daughter skipped along beside her, holding her hand in a tight grip, as if trying to anchor her to this new, hopeful reality. The town's main street was a long, dusty scar. Doors were cracked open, faces peered out from behind lace curtains. She could feel their eyes on her back, feel their whispers slithering through the air like invisible snakes. She kept her head down, her shoulders hunched. She went into the general store, her voice barely a whisper, as she asked the shopkeeper for flour, salt, and soap. The shopkeeper was a thin man with a sour face. His eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down. He wasn't just looking at her, he was measuring her past, weighing her sins. He glanced at the coins in her hand, then at the child clinging to her skirt. "So," he said, his voice dripping with scorn, "he took you in, did he? Reckon pity makes a fool out of any man." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the quiet store. A woman standing by the door sniffed loudly, a sound of pure disapproval. A man outside, stacking barrels, let out a low, ugly chuckle. The mother's cheeks burned with a familiar hot shame. She grabbed her small bundle of supplies, her only thought to get out of there, to escape before the tears she was fighting back could betray her. But her daughter, her fierce, unbroken little girl, stepped forward. She planted her small feet and balled her hands into tiny fists. "She's good," the girl's voice trembled, but it was clear and defiant. "You don't know her." The shopkeeper blinked, taken aback by the child's boldness. Then a nasty sneer twisted his lips. "Children learn lies quick enough," he said, shaking his head, "when they're taught by a liar." The woman snatched her daughter's hand and practically ran from the store. The little girl's brave words echoed in her ears. They were both a comfort and a wound. It broke her heart that a child so young should have to learn to defend her own mother from the cruelty of the world. When they got back to the cabin, the cowboy was by the shed, splitting firewood. The rhythmic thwack of the axe stopped when he saw them. He took one look at her face, at the tight set of her jaw and the brightness in her eyes, and he knew. He didn't ask what happened. He just took the bundle from her arms and carried it inside. His silence wasn't coldness, it was a shield. It felt as if he was taking the weight of the town's scorn from her shoulders and carrying it himself. Later that day, he rode into town for his own supplies, and the whispers found him too. An old ranch hand, leaning against a hitching post, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "You'll ruin yourself, son," the old man rasped, shaking his head, "taking in strays like that one. Folks around here, they don't forget." He gave the cowboy a knowing look. "Best you let her go, before she drags you down into the mud with her." The cowboy didn't even break his stride. He just fixed the old man with a calm, level gaze. His voice was low, but it cut through the air like a knife. "She ain't a stray," he said. "She's a soul." He tipped his hat and walked on, leaving the ranch hand sputtering in his wake. That night, the fire seemed to burn a little lower, the shadows in the cabin a little deeper. The mother finally spoke the words that had been poisoning her all day. "They'll never let me stay," she said, her voice heavy with the certainty of defeat. "Not really. You'll end up paying the price for sheltering me." Her eyes shimmered with tears she refused to let fall. She had lived under the shadow of judgment for so long, she had forgotten what it felt like to believe in anything else. He was stirring the embers with an iron poker. Sparks flew up, like a flurry of tiny dying stars. "I ain't beholden to their reckoning," he said simply, his eyes on the fire. "I seen what I seen, and that's enough." She wanted to believe him. Oh, how she wanted to rest in the strength of his words. But doubt was a weed with deep roots. She lay awake long after her child was asleep, listening to the wind rattling the window panes. It sounded like the whispers of the town trying to find a way in. She wondered how long this small wooden cabin could stand before the storm of their judgment broke it down completely. And then she noticed something, a small detail she had overlooked in her fear and exhaustion. On the rough-hewn mantelpiece above the fire, next to a chipped tin cup, sat a small carved wooden bird. It was worn smooth with age, its painted details faded. It was identical to a toy her own father had carved for her when she was a little girl. A toy she had lost years ago, on the day her whole life had fallen apart. She stared at it, her heart starting to pound a frantic new rhythm against her ribs. It couldn't be. It was just a coincidence, a trick of the firelight. But as she looked from the bird to the sleeping man in the chair, a new and terrifying question began to form in her mind. Who was this man? And what did he really want with them? The kindness was one thing. But this felt like something else entirely. It felt like a ghost from a past she had tried so hard to bury. And she suddenly realized the storm she feared wasn't just outside the cabin walls. It might already be inside. The days that followed settled into a strange, fragile rhythm. Dawn would break, spilling pale light across the floorboards. The child would wake and chase the chickens. Her laughter a bright, clean sound against the vast silence of the plains. The mother started to find pieces of her old self again. She baked bread, her hands rediscovering the familiar, comforting feel of kneading dough. She swept the cabin, mended the cowboys' shirts, and found a quiet satisfaction in the simple, honest work. Each small act was like laying a stone, building the foundation of something she was still too afraid to call a home. The cowboy, whose name she learned was Caleb, remained a quiet, steady presence. He moved through his days with an economy of motion, fixing fences, tending to his horse, chopping wood. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, but his presence filled the small cabin. It was a solid, grounding thing. He never asked for thanks. He never mentioned the town. He just existed alongside them, a silent guardian. One afternoon, the little girl was watching him saddle a small pony he kept in the corral. Her eyes were huge with longing. "Could I?" she whispered, her voice full of awe. Caleb looked over at her mother. She hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. He carefully lifted the girl onto the pony's back, his large, scarred hands gentle as he positioned her. "Hold on tight now," he said, his rough voice softer than she'd ever heard it. The little girl let out a squeal of pure joy as the pony took a few slow steps. Her laughter echoed in the clear air, a sound like tumbling water. The mother stood on the porch, her arms crossed, watching them. She felt a painful twist in her heart, a mix of fear and a gratitude so sharp it almost hurt. When the ride was over, the girl slid down and ran to her, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mama, I really rode a horse." For the first time in what felt like a century, the mother laughed, a real, genuine laugh that startled even her. It felt foreign in her own throat. In the evenings, they started working on a small patch of garden next to the porch. Caleb turned the soil with a shovel, and she and the child planted seeds from a small cloth bag he'd kept stored away. The mother pressed the tiny seeds into the dark, cool earth. Her daughter's small hands patted the dirt down flat over them. "Will they grow, Mama?" the girl asked. Before she could answer, Caleb leaned on his shovel. "They will," he said, his eyes on the horizon, "if we give 'em time." The words settled deep inside the woman. He was talking about more than just seeds. He was talking about them. about the possibility that with patience and care, something other than hunger and loss could grow in this place. But the shadows were always there, clinging to the edges of their new life. One evening, as she was mending a tear in her daughter's dress by the fire, she found herself speaking about the past. The words came out in broken pieces, halting and full of pain. "I wasn't wicked," she whispered, the needle trembling in her fingers. "They said I was. They said I didn't deserve a place among good folk." She couldn't look at him. She just stared at the worn fabric in her lap. Caleb was sitting across from her, cleaning a piece of his saddle tack. He let the silence stretch out for a long moment. When he finally answered, his voice was low and steady. "Home ain't a place that asks if you're fit for it," he said. "It's just a place that waits for you to make it." The words were like a warm blanket settling over her. She didn't reply, but the shaking in her hands stopped. And for the first time, she allowed a tiny sliver of an idea to take root in her mind. Maybe she wasn't unworthy of belonging after all. The child, with her innocent wisdom, became the bridge between the two quiet adults. She would pick wildflowers and leave them on Caleb's chair. She would bring him a dipper of cool water when he was working in the sun. She would beg him for stories about cattle drives and thunderstorms on the open range. His answers were always short and to the point, but the woman noticed the way his eyes would soften whenever the little girl tugged on his sleeve. She watched these small moments with a quiet ache in her chest. She had been so sure that her daughter's life would be defined by her own shame. But here, in this quiet man's presence, she saw her daughter's laughter bloom as easily and naturally as the wildflowers she picked. Still, the world outside their small patch of land was always pressing in. When she went into town with him for supplies, the whispers were a physical force, a wave of hostility that washed over them. Mothers would pull their children away as they passed. Men would smirk and nudge each other. On one trip, her daughter, sensing the tension, reached up and took Caleb's hand. He didn't hesitate. His large, calloused hand closed around her small one. The woman saw it, and she felt something inside her shift, a fragile thread pulling tight. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was the beginning of a trust she never thought she'd feel again. One evening, dark storm clouds rolled in, and thunder rumbled in the distance. The three of them rushed to pull the laundry from the line before the rain came. The little girl shrieked with laughter as the first cold drops hit her face. Caleb scooped her up in his arms and ran for the porch just as the sky opened up. They tumbled inside, laughing and dripping wet. The mother, her hair plastered to her face, looked up and met Caleb's eyes. For a single breathless moment, something unspoken passed between them. It was something that terrified her as much as it steadied her. The storm raged all night, the wind howling and the rain beating against the roof. The child slept soundly, curled up in a nest of quilts. But the mother lay awake, listening. She heard the thunder, but she also heard the echo of the preacher's words. The little ones often bear it hardest. That warning haunted her. She couldn't shake the terrifying fear that the world would find a way to rip this fragile new life away from them. Near dawn, the storm finally passed. She slipped out of bed and went to the porch. The world was washed clean, and the air was cool and damp. Caleb was already there, sitting in a chair in the grey pre-dawn light, his hat tipped back, his eyes on the horizon. He didn't turn as she came to stand beside him. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the sound of water dripping from the roof. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough. "They'll come knocking," he said, his voice flat and certain. "Mark my words, folks don't abide what they don't understand." He turned then, and his steady eyes found hers in the dim light. "Question is," he said, his voice dropping lower, "what do you do when they do?" The words hit her harder than any thunderclap, because she knew he was right. The storm had passed, but the real trouble was still coming, and she had no idea what she was going to do. The day of reckoning didn't come with thunder and lightning. It came quietly in the soft, fading light of dusk. The sun was a bleeding orange smear on the horizon, and the shadows of the fence posts stretched like long, dark fingers across the yard. The mother had just pulled a bucket of water from the well. Her daughter was beside her, humming a little tune to herself when the sound reached them. A low, rhythmic thudding carried on the evening breeze. It wasn't one horse, it was many. The sound of hooves hitting the dry earth in unison. A cloud of dust was rising in the distance, like smoke from a fire that hadn't been set yet. She froze. The water slopped over the rim of the bucket, soaking the front of her dress. The child's humming stopped. Caleb stepped out of the barn, a greasy rag in his hand. His head came up and his eyes narrowed as he saw the dark line of riders approaching. He dropped the rag. In 2 long strides, he was beside the child, his hand resting on her small shoulder. His voice was calm, but it was heavy with a terrible certainty. "Stay close," he said. "Both of you." The riders came into full view. It was a posse from the town, and they were led by the preacher, a black-clad figure on a pale horse. Behind him were men with hard, unforgiving faces and women whose lips were pressed into thin lines of self-righteous judgment. They pulled their horses up just outside the fence. The animals snorted and stamped, their breath misting in the cooling air. The dust swirled around them like a ghostly shroud. The preacher raised a hand, and a heavy silence fell over the yard. "You shelter abomination under your roof," he called out, his voice smooth as oil but sharp as broken glass. "This woman has been judged by God and by this community. She was cast out for her sins. And you," he pointed a long bony finger at Caleb, "you would let her child grow up under that same filthy stain." His cold eyes swept over the mother, lingering on her bowed head. Then he turned his gaze back to Caleb. "You bring ruin upon yourself, and worse, you mock the holy laws of God by consorting with the unclean." The little girl was clinging to her mother's skirt, her small body trembling. "Mama," she whispered. The woman's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. She had known this was coming. In the darkest part of her heart, she had always known. She had even prepared herself for it, telling herself she would surrender, that she would walk away again, if it meant they would leave her daughter alone. But Caleb stepped forward. He moved to stand between her and the crowd at the fence, a solid, unmoving wall. His shoulders were squared, his chin was up, his voice was low, but it carried across the yard, steady and clear. "This here's my land," he said, "my roof, and my say. She ain't yours to judge anymore." A low murmur rippled through the riders. The preacher's face tightened. He raised his chin, his voice rising in a biblical cadence. "The wages of sin is death. The good book warns us. It is better that this child be taken from her mother's corruption and placed in righteous hands than be left to perish in this pit of filth." The woman's knees went weak. Tears burned her eyes. She reached for her daughter, ready to give up, ready to do whatever they wanted. But the little girl tore away from her. She ran to Caleb and wrapped her arms around his leg, clinging to him with all her might. Her small voice was cracked with tears, but it rang out clear as a bell. "Don't let him take us," she cried. "Please." Caleb's jaw clenched. He looked down at the small, desperate child clinging to him. Then he looked back up at the crowd. He didn't look at the preacher. He looked at the faces of the other townsfolk, the ones hiding behind the preacher's righteousness. Scripture also says, his voice rose, calm and unshakable, "Suffer the little children to come unto me, and forbid them not." He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he delivered the final blow. "You call what I'm doing a sin," he said, his voice ringing with a power she had never heard before. "I call it building a family." A stunned hush fell over the crowd. It was heavier, thicker than the dust their horses had kicked up. The preacher's mouth opened, but for a moment no words came out. Some of the riders shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, their eyes darting away from Caleb's steady gaze. One of the women, who had been sneering just moments before, now stared down at the reins in her hands, her face suddenly uncertain. The solid wall of their condemnation had just cracked. Met with such quiet, unyielding defiance, it was starting to crumble. The mother, still trembling, slowly lifted her head. And in that moment, she saw him clearly for the first time. He wasn't just a rescuer. He wasn't a hero from a storybook. He was just a man. A man who was deliberately, consciously choosing to stand in the middle of the storm with her. That realization was like a lightning strike, burning away the last vestiges of her shame. She took a step forward, then another, until she was standing right beside him. Her hand came to rest on her daughter's head, grounding all 3 of them together. The preacher found his voice again, but it was weaker now, stripped of its righteous thunder. You'll bear the weight of this choice, he spat. Caleb gave a single firm nod. Then I'll bear it. The silence stretched out again, broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the restless shuffling of the horses. Then, one by one, without another word spoken, the riders began to turn their horses around. The dust rose in their wake as they retreated back toward the town. The preacher was the last to leave, his black coat a fading shadow swallowed up by the deepening dusk. The yard was still. The only sound was the distant, lonely cry of a crow. The mother let out a shuddering breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of fear anymore. She knelt and pulled her daughter into a fierce hug. Caleb stood motionless, his eyes on the horizon, watching until the last rider had completely disappeared. Then he turned. And when his eyes met hers, the hardness was gone. All she saw was a quiet softness, a silent understanding. Inside the cabin, the firelight seemed warmer, brighter than ever before. Supper was just beans and cornbread, same as always, but it felt like a king's feast. The child, her fear forgotten, was laughing at some small joke, scattering crumbs all over the table. The mother's hand still shook a little as she lifted her spoon, but when she glanced up, she saw Caleb watching her. There was no judgment in his eyes. No pity. Just a quiet, steady regard. She looked away quickly, but a warmth spread through her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The night grew deeper. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, but inside the small cabin, the fire held, its warm light wrapping around the three of them like a fragile promise. The mother tucked her daughter into her small bed, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. Then she sat by the fire, just listening to the crackle of the logs and the faint rhythmic sound of Caleb cleaning his tools. This wasn't salvation carved in stone, it wasn't a vow shouted to the heavens, it was just a piece of cornbread passed across a wooden table. It was the sound of her child's laughter mixing with the song of a fire. It was the quiet strength of a man who had looked at the two of them, lost and broken, and had chosen them. And she thought that maybe, just maybe, that was how real homes were built out here on the frontier. Not with grand gestures or loud declarations, but in the small, hushed defiance of a single kindness that simply refused to let go. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.